Dear my students and friends from all over the world, I mean, we got dozens of lectures during the pandemic about the current world and post-pandemic world order. And in this week, I mean, I got a very old friend from Bulgaria, Professor Krassen Stanchev. He is former a member of Constitutional Parliament in Bulgaria. He used to economic advisor to Bulgarian president. And he's a professor in Sofia University. As you may be aware, Balkans is mainly called as a instability, rudeness, wars after the 1990s. The term Balkanization in IR theory is becoming quite known with most of the people around the world. Balkans means instability, Balkans means problem. But I think in this week, in this lecture, Professor Stanchev will draw another picture, De-Balkanization of Balkans. Please, Krassen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ahmed. It's my pleasure to talk to my friends in Turkey and around the globe. So the topic is with me for about 20 or more years. I got interested in the Balkans. I mean, like most of the people in my age, you know, living in a closed country, like it was the story of this part of Europe. I was mostly interested, you know, about the West because we were not basically living the socialist camp. As a student, I was traveling around the world, but this was the communist world, not the Western world. So we were not allowed to visit neighbors. We were not allowed to visit Turkey. We had a great issue in the mid-80s with communist authorities taking the Muslim names of the Bulgarian Turks. So the borders to Turkey were basically closed. And I wanted to go to Istanbul, for example, since I was about a teenage, you know. My father was a swimmer. He's a journalist and a swimmer. And he visited Istanbul once, you know, to swim across the Bosphorus. And I wanted to go with him, but we were not allowed, you know, to travel together. So when the communist camp was opened, my immediate task was, you know, to see the neighbors. And my second task, you know, was, of course, you know, to see the West. So, and then the Balkan War happened. I was still with the parliament. The tensions were over there. And then, you know, I took it as my priority, you know, to learn where we live, you know, to learn about the Balkans. And I was shocked, you know, about the bad image of the Balkans. All the people are really very good and very friendly to one another. Kitchen is great. Drinks are great. Everybody is a friend to everyone. So, so with this short introduction, I will go to my points of de-Balkanization, which is some sort of a summary of all my experience with the Balkans, which is not trivial. I have been involved in the reforms in the communist Balkans. I have visited Turkey many times, you know, for different occasions, including NATO conferences, university conferences, free market roadshow, Istanbul Freedom Network, Association for Liberal Thinking, and you name it. So, so plus in the early 90s, I created the so-called East European Economist Network, even before we had internet. So, and it was a group of economists dealing with market reforms, liberalization, and other issues in our countries. So, somebody quoted someone some time ago, Churchill, that Balkans were producing more history than they can consume. This was repeated by Margaret Thatcher very late, in her last lecture, in the 90s, in Fulham, in the United States. And then I look at the files, and I realized that it was not said about the Balkans, it was said about the island of Crete. As everybody in Turkey should know, island of Crete, was a free trade zone, most of the time. Like many islands of the Aegean Sea, with free trade zone, for one very simple reason, for the Sultan or for then Greek authorities, it was very difficult, to control them. So they were free trade zones, and in the middle of the 19th century, when the newly independent Greece was looking for a king, King Leopold of Belgium was invited to become a king of Greece. He said, yes, I like the country, but I would like to have the island of Crete included. So that was a mess, nobody agreed, to give him the island. And then it was said that the Balkans produced so much, but it was not the Balkans, it was said about the Crete. So, the first thing, I would like to mention, a colleague in Germany, Stephen Alman, produces already 50, I think, the so-called Good Country Index. If you look at the Good Country Index, all the Balkan countries are in the good side. All the former Soviet Union countries and Russia, they're on the bad side. So Turkey, changed a bit, in the recent years, but that's not so important. If you look at the so-called ex-communist Europe, and you take the Freedom House Index of Democracy and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development Transition Index, you will see that like 20-something years ago, all the Balkan countries were somewhere in the past. So if you look at the picture, like 5 years ago, all the Balkan countries are already in the lead in terms of democracy and market reforms. Macedonia, Albania, Montenegro, they still remain there, but they're in green, which basically means, that they are Balkans, but they will be moving, to some graduated set of countries like Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, Poland, Czech Republic, Lithuania, and so on and so on. So another thing is if you look at terrorism, so the Western Balkan fighters, I mean, I mentioned Western Balkan because there are countries, which, I mean, where the Muslim minorities is relatively or is a majority. From the European, that's why I made a mistake. From the European perspective, Bulgaria is the most Muslim populated country in Europe. So with about 14% of the population, from the Muslim denomination. Of course, the most Muslim country in Europe, if it was in Europe, would have been Russia, because Muslim minority in Russia is about 20%. But if you look at the contribution of the Muslim Balkans, to different unpleasant developments in the Middle East, including the Islamic State, the war in Syria, Iraq, and that sort of stuff. For all these years, we have these conflicts, meaning Iraq is quite many years already, since 2003. Or the 5-6 years in Syria, the contribution of volunteers, for the Islamic State from Albania is about 100, from Bosnia is about 240, from Kosovo is about 300, from Macedonia about 150. Even from Montenegro you have 23, and from Serbia about 50. From Bulgaria, there are 7. So, I mean, our countries are not contributing, you know, to from Turkey, they're basically as much as from Bosnia and Herzegovina. So Turkey is not contributing, you know, to the conflict as well, although Turkey has other issues. At the same time, if you look at the Muslim universities, you know, in the Balkans, this is some sort of a brackets, you know, the Muslim theologians of Sarajevo are one of the most advanced economies in the world at the moment. You know? So when I read what they were participating in the Istanbul Freedom Network, you know, for many years, and they are still participating. If you look at their lectures over there, you will see, you know, how liberally minded all these people. Liberally minded, in my point of view, this is not the American sense. In my point of view, liberally minded means, you know, classic European values or classic liberalism, like John Locke and after. So if you look at the terrorism index, which is the next column, so it is not there. It is not present in the Balkan countries. Simply not present. If you see in the global terrorism database of the Maryland University, you will see, you know, like for the last 10 years, 5 cases, 6 cases, 20 cases, but they count in this personal revenge. And for example, in Albania, personal revenge is, or among Albanians, it's the best law. It's more a personal thing rather than anything else. So if you look at the suicidal rates in our countries are virtually not there. And in Bulgaria, they are more than in the Western Balkans or Greece. So, and if you look at the suicidal rates, you know, France, Belgium, Lithuania, the so-called, you know, great countries of Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, Russia, Ukraine, you know, the rates are really, really very high, you know, compared to. The same is the story with the suicidal rates, but let's, they are more popular, you know. So, economic way of thinking about the Balkans. Here is the long-term GDP per capita. It's real, it's adjusted for price changes in international dollars of 2011. And if you look at the countries, you know, like before communism, you know, at the end of the 19th century, and the first about 30 years of the 20th century, the countries were developing relatively at par with the entire Europe. So if you go to our world in data, you may combine, you know, different GDP developments, GDP per capita developments, you know, for the last 200 years, and you will see that many of the Balkan countries, including Bulgaria, they were much more developed than the rest of the world or the rest of Europe, in fact. So, of course, there are specific cases, you know, there were different whatever tensions and that sort of stuff, you know. The Ottoman Empire was basically very tolerant towards different parts of the empire getting independent. And the new countries were paying with similar tolerance. For example, Bulgaria was paying, you know, the refugees from Bulgaria to the Ottoman Empire. Greece, or the new whatever chieftains, because it was not exactly whatever a unified state for many years. Different parts of Greece, they never expropriated former Ottoman owners of land or something else. So they were buying land, you know, from them. So, and they were, of course, they were asking the government to buy land, you know, from the former Ottoman owners. Why? Because they believe that because the government is theirs, meaning Greek, you know, they can bribe, you know, somebody from the government to give them the land afterwards. But anyway, the key fact here is that, there was nobody expropriated. Bulgarians expropriated more former neighbors who fled to Ottoman Empire than the Greeks. The Greeks were really very tolerant. If you look at the high value added of the economies, so you see that half of the countries in the last 50 years they were developing relatively okay, and most of them were relatively better compared to the so-called Eastern Tigers in China. So the value added, which the economies of the Balkans, I did not include here Turkey because Turkey is an outlier of Greece. Greece is basically, until recently, until the last 5 years, Greece was much more in the lower value added trade than the rest of the Balkans, or Turkey or Bulgaria or Macedonia even. And this is the case with what you see here on this graph also is that in the last years after the Dayton Agreement, the value added of trade is going up for all former ex-Yugoslav countries, except for Montenegro, because Montenegro it's a very peculiar economy. It's an economy of 1/4 of Istanbul, one neighborhood of Istanbul. The entire country is 650,000 listed. So eventually they have about 450,000 living in the country. And the entire industry, most of it is tourism and raw materials, but the entire industry used to be owned by which is an aluminum factory, used to be owned by one of the Russian oligarchs who bankrupted because he wanted to receive power. So that's why you have these dynamics in Montenegro. The top trading partners, including Turkey, is the European Union. Russia is not existing. I will give you an example, for Bulgaria, but the same, Bulgaria is one of the friends of Russia, yes? So Bulgarians export to Russia, which basically means that for Bulgaria, Russia must be some sort of important market. That's why it's better to look at the export, not about the entire trade, because if you look at the entire trade, Russia sells to us, for example, natural gas, some petrol and that sort of stuff, or nuclear fuel. But what is important is what we sell to Russia, where the income comes from. So Russia is as important to Bulgaria as Macedonia. So the most stupid thing, done by Bulgaria as a government is the recent blockage of negotiation of accession talks between Macedonia, Albania, and the European Union, because these two countries are more important than Russia, for the Bulgarian income, for the well-being of the Bulgarian citizens. So, so Russia comes for the entire Balkans somewhere on the 15th place in terms of trading partners. So, but it is trying, to be somewhat, how to say, somewhat influential. And what they do with the part of the revenue, they sell natural gas to our countries or petrol to our countries. They leave the revenue in Switzerland or in our countries, and in our countries they finance, nationalistic Nazi-like parties, who are basically willing, to create a mess. And of course, they do press, they do media. Here's how it is being done. The integration of the Balkans with the rest of the world. It was done through the European Union for one very simple reason, or the European Economic Community, for one very simple reason. And this is when you trade with somebody who is richer than you, it is very likely that you will become rich. If you trade with somebody who is poorer than you, it's very likely that you will remain poor. So, and that's why, you know, especially after Dayton, a group of people, I was in that group, we've managed to push the European Union to proceed with the Western Balkans like they had proceeded years before with Turkey to sign a free trade agreement. But we made it better because Turkey was not coming out of the war, Western Balkans were coming out of the war. And it was a nasty people's civil war. So we managed to convince the European Union to unilaterally liberalize its trade. They removed all the tariffs for the Western Balkans. And they left, you know, like fish, wine, and I think one of other products. And in 1 year, it was eliminated too. So that's how the Western Balkans basically developed. And of course, developing the trade with the European Union, they developed the trade with the rest of the Balkans, including Greece. So Greece was sort of not recognizing Macedonia and that sort of stuff. They didn't like the name, but the Greeks were allowed to buy properties, and they bought, you know, the biggest refinery, actually the only one reasonable refinery near Skopje, and they were building roads. They were involved in tourism. They invested in IT industry around Skopje and Tetovo. So that's how the thing worked. So if you compare our countries with the former Soviet Union, and here I took I took the merchandise trade as share of GDP. In our countries, it's much higher than for the former Soviet Union. From the former Soviet Union, only Moldova resembles some of our countries. So for the rest of our countries, especially last year, before the pandemic, the year before, sorry, before the pandemic, the trade was about the average. The trade to GDP ratio was above 120%, except for Turkey, because Turkey is a very large domestic market. And that's the reason. Bigger countries, bigger domestic markets, you know, obviously, you know, have a lesser trade to GDP ratio than other countries. But for the Balkans, you know, we are much more open than China, India, Russia, 3 times more open than Russia, and twice more open than the United Kingdom. For the same reason that Russia and the United Kingdom are relatively big markets. So we are not doing anything to anyone. These are the foreign direct investment as part of GDP in some of the Balkan countries. You see for the years between 2007 and 2015, they were considerably contributing, you know, to the local economies. The outlier here is this pink, whatever line, is Montenegro. This is because the investment I've mentioned, you know, Oleg Deripaska bought one factory which was contributed to 35% of Montenegrin GDP. But we are much more open in terms of inviting people to invest in our countries than anybody else. So this is the extreme poverty. If you look at the world and you look at our countries, we are much better doing, you know, than anybody else. I don't know what will happen as a result of COVID-19, but it's very likely that we will return somewhere in 2015. That's why I put, you know, 2015 here. So which basically means that in our countries, the extremely poor, meaning those who live at $1.90 US per day, they will be about 1.5% of the population. Or, I mean, if the pandemic of the last year and this year, has a negative impact, even if it will be like 2%. So we are still better than most of the world. In the United States, extremely poor are less than in Turkey, are more than in Turkey. So in the United States in 2019, the extremely poor were about 1.6, 1.7% of the population.
Yeah.
With all the refugees, of course, including because Turkey, has accepted lots of refugees from the conflicts in Syria and Lebanon. So notes on the rhetoric. I would basically finish here because my time is over.
Yeah.
We agreed that I will be talking about 20-25 minutes. But if somebody has questions, I can talk about the rhetoric and the literature. Ahmed, I'm happy to share this with the audience. If somebody is interested, I'm happy to answer emails. In the next slides, I have a couple of sources, and the previous slides, I have a couple of sources mentioned. Okay. Of course, there are sources everybody knows about, like Intact, reports on foreign investment, on trade, like the global terrorism database, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Okay, you may stop slide sharing if you wish. So then.
Yes, I will.
Thank you very much, Krassen. Very good presentation. It's just remind me that remember before millennium we worked on the same project, Balkans 2010 economic scenarios. In the end, in the final report, I do remember. I think it's published in 2002 something. That there are different possible outcomes. That flourishing Balkans and Balkan basement. The best is flourishing Balkans, and the worst is Balkan basement. Dumped in somewhere in the world. It seems that what we see in the flourishing Balkans, as we observe, this is one of the options that, as you may see in your pictures, diagrams, that Bulgaria is going very well as far as I observe, because I spent a year in Varna. As you know, it's quite amazing. Because then this is a sort of a new contribution to academia, that Balkanization is not a pessimistic way. Balkanization will be flourishing economy, prosperity, wealth, something, I think. And thank you very much for your very well-organized conference. Most probably my students and my colleagues will like that. And if they wish to contact you, I will send your contact details anyway. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All the best.
Bye.
Bye.